الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brothers, sisters and friends. Let me begin by thanking Sheffield University Science Society for inviting me again to deliver today a lecture on the history of the Ottoman Dynasty. Now, or dynasty, I heard someone mention dynasty, let me begin by saying that there is in no shape or form can I deliver a history of the Ottoman Dynasty in any serious depth with the time that I have. In fact, if I was given 4 or 5 hours, I still wouldn't be able to deliver any justice to the depth that's really required to understand the Ottoman Dynasty, or any dynasty for that matter. Entire books, lectures, series, podcasts have been dedicated to certain periods of Ottoman history. But what I will try my best today is to give you all an overview of the history of the Ottoman Empire with key events, key incidents, and some key discussion points. And inshallah, it should be a starter for any of you who want to pursue further research into the Ottomans. Now, the history of the Ottoman dynasty has to begin with the dream of Osman. Now, in front of you all should have a handout, and the first thing that's on the handout in italics should be the dream of Osman. Now, let me tell you about the dream of Osman. Now, Osman I, rahimahullah, he was the first Ottoman ruler, the first Ottoman Sultan. And one night, when he was a young man, he was spending the night with a very prominent scholar of Anatolia called Sheikh Edebali, rahimahullah, who later became his father-in-law. And he spent a night at the Sheikh's house, and that night he had a dream. And the dream was that a full moon left the chest of the Sheikh and entered Osman's chest. And when that full moon entered his chest, a tree began to grow from his navel. And that tree continued to grow. And within this dream, Osman saw very iconic regions which later on the Ottomans would go on to rule. For example, in his dream he saw Mount Atlas, Mount Taurus, the Mount Caucasus. He also saw a number of iconic rivers, the River Nile, the River Danube, the Euphrates, the Tigris. And this tree continued to grow. And it continued to grow under the light of a crescent. And as it was growing, towards the end of the dream, there was a muaddin who made the adhan. This was Osman's dream. When he awoke, he conveyed this dream to Sheikh Edebali, who interpreted it as follows. He said, "My son, I, in this dream, represented knowledge. The full moon which left my chest to yours would be the knowledge that will be passed from myself and generally the ulama, the scholars, over to your household. That tree which spread from your navel will be the great state that your progeny will go on to establish. And those rivers and those mountainous regions that you saw, you will, or your progeny will, go on to conquer these lands. And the crescent upon which the light shone upon the tree is Islam. And the muaddin who made the adhan means that there will come a point where this state of yours will be the only legitimate Islamic authority on this earth." That's how the dream was interpreted by Sheikh Edebali. From this point onward, every single Ottoman ruler had this vision. In fact, it became the underlying philosophy of the Ottoman Empire and its state, that they would go on to continue to expand, that they perceived themselves as a legitimate Islamic authority, and that So as long as the justice of Islam was upheld in the lands in which they ruled, this state will continue to expand. That is basically where most books and literature about the Ottomans begins. It begins with Osman's dream. However, for those of you who perhaps may be watching a hit Turkish show called Derilish Ertuğrul, you know that, okay, maybe the history of the Ottomans actually began before Osman, and you'd be correct. So Osman's father was Ghazi Ertuğrul, rahimahullah, a very great leader. May Allah have mercy on his soul. Ameen. And he initially built the blueprint to what was going to become the Ottoman state. And for those of you who are watching Dilly Hussain, you know that before they became known as the Ottomans or Osmanli, they were known as the Kayis. The Kayi tribe was one of many Turkic tribes who began in the steppes of Central Asia. They were one of many. And they all traced their lineage back to an individual called Oğuz Khan. Now, for those of you who attended the Uyghur lecture, I also mentioned that the Uyghurs, they traced their lineage back to Oğuz Khan. Oğuz Khan was not Muslim, by the way, but he was considered as the founding father of the Turkic race. So the Kayis were one of many of these tribes that made up a nomadic confederation. And due to nomadic lifestyle, they migrated to different parts of the world. For example, the Uyghurs, they migrated eastwards towards East Pakistan or China or Xinjiang, however you want to pronounce it. Others headed southwards towards Central Asia and Iran, whereas other Turkic tribes, they migrated westwards towards Anatolia for different reasons. And eventually, when the Kayis arrived in Anatolia, Anatolia was under the control of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome. Now, the Seljuks were another powerful and prominent Turkic Muslim sultanate. And the Seljuk Sultanate of Rome basically just means the Seljuk state of Rome or Europe. And the Kayis had settled in the borders of the Seljuk state, which bordered the Byzantine Empire. And they were under the protectorate of the Seljuk Empire. Now, we're talking here late 12th century, early 13th century. Now, as the Seljuk Empire was rapidly declining as a result of internal disputes and warfare, as well as the Mongol onslaught that came from the east, after the Seljuk Empire eventually was abolished, what was left in the remnants of Anatolia was small little beyliks. Yeah? Again, for those of you who are watching the village, if you know some of this language, beylik, yeah? It means a small principality state. In essence, these beyliks was what the Seljuks had essentially given many of the Turkic tribes as a kind of semi-autonomous towns, perhaps cities, where they would essentially run those respective areas in alignment with Seljuk policy. So after the Seljuks had essentially demised, the Kayis established their beylik, which then went on to, or evolved into the Ottoman Sultanate. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning of the lecture, I really cannot give any serious justice or depth to this topic. Because, you know, historians will literally, of Western secular Muslim scholars and academics literally have dedicated entire books in just like small periods of Ottoman history. Some scholars have dedicated entire literature just on one ruler. So I will try my best to essentially give you guys an overview of the most important events, right? And that's not to say that the events or the timeline that you got in front of you in that slide is all the important events that had taken place within the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Dynasty. You have to keep in mind that the Ottomans were around from 1299 to 1924. That's a huge period of history. However, I have identified the following events to be something of importance So if I go in order, so 1299. 1299 was when Sultan Osman, he made the Beylik into an official state, a state which was not dependent on any other superpower or empire of the time. That was in 1299. In 1402 to 1413, we had the Ottoman interregnum, which is basically the Ottoman Civil War. That is when the three sons of Murad I, who I will touch upon who he is in the next slide. Murad I was the grandson of Osman, and he was a very powerful Ottoman ruler. He got into a war with a leader called Timur Lane. Timur Lane is someone who is of Mongol Turkic ethnicity, and the Mughal dynasty of India traced their lineage back to Timur Lane. Anyway, the Ottomans were defeated by Timur, the Timur Empire. And in the aftermath of that war, the three sons of Murad, they began a civil war and a power struggle as to who would assume power after the capture of their father. Now, the reason why this period is so important is because it was in these 11 years that the Ottoman state nearly self-imploded. It was in this period that the Ottoman state literally nearly ceased to exist because of the civil war. How many Muslims and non-Muslims that were killed in the civil war, the fact that the three brothers had allied themselves with European entities that traditionally were their rivals. It was a very, very bloody period. It was a period which, as I mentioned, nearly destroyed the state. And it was out of this period that there was a policy called the royal fratricide, whereby Ottoman princes, known as Shahzadeh, they would kill their brothers. It was a state policy that to avoid civil war, to avoid the state from self-imploding, to protect the unity of the state, that we would kill our brothers to not have a repetition of this incident, which nearly destroyed what our forefathers had built. 1453 is perhaps the most important event, not only in Ottoman history, perhaps one of the most important events in Islamic history. And that was when the Ottomans, under the leadership of Sultan Mehmed II, rahimahullah, they conquered Constantinople. And that is because that conquest was prophesied by our beloved Prophet ﷺ in a hadith which was narrated by Abu Ayyub al-Ansari radiallahu anhu, who's actually buried in Istanbul today. And to paraphrase this hadith, our beloved Prophet said that indeed the Muslims will conquer Constantinople, and the ruler and the leader who takes Constantinople will be a great leader, and those who fight under him will be a great army. And you find that Sahaba, even at that time, raced and competed with one another to fulfill this prophecy. But it was Mehmed II, rahimahullah, who fulfilled that prophecy. In 1517, Sultan Selim I became the first Khalifa of the Ottoman Dynasty, when he defeated the Mamluks in the Battle of Marj Dabik in Syria today. And he forcibly made the last Abbasid Khalif, Mutawakkil III, abdicate, and he declared the Ottoman state as the Khilafah. So as you can see on top of that timeline, 1299 to 1517, the Ottoman state was known as a Sultanate. And from 1517 to 1924, the Ottoman state was the Khilafah. And there were no other competing caliphates during that period. So when I mention Sultanate or Caliphate from the period 1517 onwards, I'm using them interchangeably. Though Sultanate was the kind of imperial term used to describe the Ottoman state, whereas the Khilafat or the Khilafah was the kind of religious term used to describe their state. But essentially it was the same thing, and I will use them interchangeably from the period 1517 onward. 1740 to 1768 was a very interesting period in Ottoman history, because there was this period of peace for 28 years, for the first time since 1299, the Ottomans were not in a state of war. I want you guys to think about that for a moment. From 1299 to 1740, the Ottoman state was in a constant state of warfare. Mainly offensive, but also defensive. But it was literally all fronts, never ending. But there was this period of peace. And the reason why this period is very interesting is that a number of historians, and I also hold this position, that it was this period of peace where the decline of the Ottomans began, at least from a military perspective. 1839 to 1876 saw the period of the Tanzimat reforms. Now, the Tanzimat reforms was a set of liberal reforms which were aggressively sought to be implemented within the Ottoman state. It was the first time in Ottoman history whereby elements of the Ottoman elite sought solutions, ideas from Western Europe, namely France. And so there was an aggressive and growing movement, which are known as the Young Turks, that sought to implement these changes. And two sultans were actually supportive of the Tanzimat reforms, and we can discuss this in a later slide. 1914, when Germany declared war with its neighbors, the Ottomans sided with Germany. It also needs to be made clear that the decision for the Ottomans to go to war and side with the Germans was not that of the Sultan or the Khalif at the time. By that time, the Ottoman state was being run by three individuals. They were known famously as the three Pashas, and they were part of the Young Turk movement. And it was they who made the decision, essentially, to enter World War I to side with Germany. And of course, they lost. They were defeated. And in 1922, we saw the Sultanate, the Ottoman Sultanate, the imperial institution, dissolve. In 1923, we saw the Treaty of Lausanne, which basically was the partitioning of former Ottoman territories that were then handed over to Britain and France that became British and French mandates. And last but not least, in 1924, we saw the abolishment of the Ottoman Caliphate. And that was the last event in Ottoman history. Notable rulers. All in all, there were 36 sultans. Out of 36 sultans, 28 of them were khulafa. So from Osman I to the 8th sultan, they were all sultans. They were never khalifs. So we know when we talk about the Ottomans, I've heard it in some circles, when we talk about the Ottomans, there's a mistake that, the Ottoman Caliphate. When you say the Ottoman Caliphate, you need to be specifically talking about the period of 1517 onward. Because 1299 to 1516, there was no Ottoman Caliphate. It was the Ottoman Sultanates. And so from the 36 rulers, there were 28 Khalifs, and they all were known for something or another. But I identified the following 10 for a number of important reasons. Osman I, the founding father of the state. Murad I. Murad I was the third sultan and the grandson of Osman. Now, if Ertugrul Ghazi, rahimahullah, was regarded as the person who created the blueprint, the Beylik, of what was going to become the Ottoman state, and Osman I was the one who established the Ottoman state, it was Murad I who essentially identified the state by building its institutions, by building its structures, by winning key strategic battles, by expanding the state rapidly, especially in the Balkans. It was under Murad I where Kosovo, Bosnia, Serbia, Albania, as well as a number of key Byzantine cities were taken. It was also under Murad I that he created and established the Janissaries. Now I will discuss who the Janissaries were later on, but just to let you guys know what they were an elite fighting corps within the Ottoman military. Of course, Mehmed II, known as the Conqueror, the person who fulfilled the prophecy, but also the individual who implemented and began the policy of fratricide. I know it's sometimes a bit crazy to understand that the great ruler that our beloved Prophet had prophesied that would conquer Constantinople was also the Sultan who introduced the policy of fratricide. Khalif Salim I, the first Khalifa of the Ottoman Dynasty. Suleiman I, known as Al-Qanuni, known as the Magnificent in European discourse. It was he who took the Ottoman state to its absolute zenith in terms of expansion. But it was also Khalif Suleiman, because he's known as Al-Qanuni, or in Turkish the lawgiver, translated, it was he who codified Ottoman law. It was he who got rid of certain nomadic and tribal rituals and practices and norms. He got rid of them, which he felt were in contradiction to Islam. He got rid of those Turkic practices which influenced Ottoman law. He codified Hanafi fiqh as an integral part of how the Ottoman state would make laws. And he also distinguished between different courts. Now, in European discourse, he's described as the Sultan who secularized Ottoman law, and that's incorrect. It's incorrect because the vast majority of European academia, they apply a kind of secular liberal paradigm or framework, usually around the notion of the nation state, in understanding how lawmaking and legislation worked in the Ottoman Empire. When in fact what Khalif Suleiman actually did was that he basically gathered all the ulama, he gathered all the judges, and he basically said those aspects of our religion and those laws which are clear cut, beyond deniability, where it is clear in text and clear in meaning, these will make up the Sharia court, and this will be the highest court in the land. And then we will have the Millah courts. These are the courts for the Jews and Christians who they can resolve their disputes in these courts, and if they're unhappy with the decision, they can refer back to the Ottoman courts. And then he had a third court, which the Europeans described as the civil courts. But essentially, this was a court which dealt with muamalat and other civil issues. But the qudaa, the judges, would still have to refer back to Islamic source texts in trying to ascertain a ruling for particular matters. This is something that's usually omitted when discussing the role of Khalif Suleiman. And it was also under Khalif Suleiman that he prioritized huge budgets for the renovation, for the infrastructure of key Islamic cities like Cairo, like Damascus, like Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. For those of you who have been to Umrah or Hajj or been to Jerusalem, you'll see that there's a lot of architecture that's still there from Khalif Suleiman's time.